the editor of the Sierra College Press, and along with the Friends of the library itself, and associated students, we put this Intellectual Salon series together now. This is our fourth year. The first year the theme was time, the second year the theme was love, last year the theme was fear, and this year the theme, as you know, is home. All the different variations. We like to do these things in an interdisciplinary kind of way. So we ask faculty to be provocateurs for us, not lecturers. You get to do that all the time with them and so on, but throw some things out there that you as students might want to engage in. And we try our best to engage in topics that you probably have some experience with, or someone in your family, or whatever. A few chairs still up here if you want to give it a try. Once we get rolling, I think I might try to slide a few more chairs over here too. I'd like to introduce our fellow provocateurs today, but before I do that, let me just tell you what's coming up. This is what we're doing today. Next month, we will be doing a kind of a biological one, non-human homes, where in the first one, we kind of looked at interpreting what a home is. Is it physical? Is it structural? Is it a feeling? Is it a sensation? Does everybody want to go home? Maybe it wasn't such a great place, all those kinds of things. So we really had a very active student engagement last time. This one's a little bit even harder in some cases, in that we're looking at people being ripped from their homes, driven from their homes, and for numerous other reasons. The next one coming up in a month is kind of the biological or a non-human biological look at homes. And then we'll end up in May at the end of the semester with Michelle Johnson, who just disappeared, and her English classes, who will be reciting some of the words.
She's invisibility. Okay. Awesome.
She's so short. So, and we'll be utilizing her students and their stories and what they've written in English composition. So today, focusing on being driven from the homes, and of course this could go on, and this could be the topic for the rest of the semester, the rest of the year. We will be doing this again next semester as well with the same home topic, but we'll be looking into major refugee crises around the world and being driven out of your home in a more contemporary way. What I've asked these folks to do is kind of look at the American experience, more or less, in experiences that we have had in our history with people being driven from homes. And there's really no rules or regulations about these salons. An intellectual salon is supposed to be where we have discourse amongst the people that have of the attendees. And so if you have questions, put the hand up there. If you have something to contribute, we would really like to hear it. Our three presenters, Amy will not be here, right? I haven't heard from Amy. Dr. Amy Myers just got a different job yesterday as Associate Dean in Science and Mathematics. And so she is a very busy woman trying to finish up what her job is now and get ready for learning how to herd cats, which is what you do as an administrator. To your left and my right is Dr. Matt Archer, who's an anthropologist and one of the advisors for the Native American Club on campus. He's a cultural anthropologist, so he's really very much interested in people and places and things of that nature. To my left and your right is Jay Hester, who is a historian, been here since 2006. He's one of the younger boys around here. And Jay teaches a variety of different histories, but specifically one of the histories that he drills down into is African American history. And then finally, Ralph Diunamuno. Got to work on that for a while. Who's an accomplished rock climber. Oh, isn't that correct? Who, well, we've been told that people of his descent are excellent climbers of walls.
Oh,
right?
geez.
So, So Ralph teaches a variety of histories, but also teaches Native American history, as well as, does she also teach Latin American? California history as well. So these will be your our guides if we seem to be going off track or we need some real information or whatever. So I just wanted to start this before they engage you and ask you if you just would just tell me, you can just blurt it out, what peoples can you immediately think of that have an American context that have been driven from their homes?
Japanese.
Japanese. Anybody else?
Native American.
Native Americans?
African Americans.
Thank you.
Mexican American. Chinese.
Polynesian.
Others?
Mexican American.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Thanks. Mexicans or Mexican Americans? You can play with that. Okay. All right.
Dreamers.
Sorry?
Dreamers.
Dreamers. Ooh, interesting. How about, I'm just going to add this one. Okay. All right. Well, we could go a lot of places in a long period of time, but we only have about an hour, so we're going to start. I think I'm just going to ask that we might start with our own soil, right? Or where we are, not just America, but California and right here, right? Who were the first humans that lived under this building, or where this building lies now? Native Americans, right? What types? Maidu, Nisenan, right? And if you've been down to the nature trail and seen the grinding rocks, and whenever there's grinding rocks and with depth, that means people came back oftentimes because it was a productive place for them and so on. Right behind the Arco over here is a road. What is the name of that road? Something Garden Road? China Garden Road. The Chinese were driven out of Rockland after the gold rush and so on. But let's start with Native America, and maybe a couple of images will help us get this rolling a little bit better. Matt, Ralph?
Sure. I'll just say a few words just to get started in terms of what you were looking at here in terms of these images. So on the left here is a map that was basically put together by Alfred Kroeber. He's an anthropologist, one of the sort of early folks in the early part of the 20th century studying in native California. This is really a language map, you'd say, that really documents the different languages in California, native languages in California, which is already superbly interesting if you think about how many languages there are really concentrated, within California, as well as then all the different cultural tribal groups that would have been present here, in sort of what you might call pre-invasion California, and so then what you can see here on the other side here, it's not exactly the best image, but you can kind of get the idea. This is contemporary tribal lands. Okay, so this is
How about if we go to this
historical tribal lands. This is contemporary tribal lands. So if you look at this map, what you see are ultimately places that are currently held in trust by the federal government for federally recognized tribes in the state of California. So these are basically the contemporary homelands of Native people in California. And it doesn't take much looking at this particular image to get a sense of the whole point. Ultimately, in the past, California was an entirely indigenous territory. and basically the whole range of California was well populated. One of the really with high population density throughout the state of California. And this is the contemporary areas where the descendants of all those people, in some sense, are living. And you can really see obviously the dramatic reduction of homeland here. Also, another thing that you can see here too is in some sense the strategic moves that have been taken place with regards to the trust lands. These are really small reservations. Right, not the kind of large-scale reservations that often when we think about reservations, in places like, Arizona, New Mexico, et cetera, or Oklahoma, or et cetera, where they're relatively large sorts of reservations. I'm talking about really fragmented, broken into really small areas, some of which, are just a couple acres, really in size. And so the basic idea here, which I'm sure you can see connects back to the topic of being driven from people's homes, is really what I think at this point most historians would agree, I hope, is really a strategic and systematic attempt to eradicate native peoples from California, and ultimately in order to make way for a settler culture. Basically, folks who were coming here, primarily gold rush and other economic opportunities, and the presence of native people in California ultimately were seen as a fundamental obstacle to that particular project. And in that way, there's a kind of complicated relationship to this notion of being driven from people's homes. In most cases in California, I think you'd have to say that native people weren't necessarily driven from their homes. They are still there, right? They are still here, and they're still here in our region. We have tribes here in the Sacramento area, just up the hill, Auburn, and down in Elk Grove, Wilton Rancheria, and et cetera, and ultimately throughout the state. And in some sense, it's really an amazing testament to the resilience and ability of indigenous Californians to resist this active strategy to, in some sense, eradicate them from their home. But it is still their home. And in some sense, all the agreements that have been made with Native people throughout the country, really, in some sense, that we really haven't upheld. Ultimately, in some ways, call to question our own sense of home in this particular place. That we really haven't addressed the fundamental injustices in the past. That in some sense enables us to have the state of California that we do now. Of course, that's just one of the relevant stories here to talk about, but particularly because it is, what some of us anyway would consider home here in our own region. It really is, an important place to start. And keep in mind, it is contemporary. Right, where we're talking about native peoples who are living, attempting to, what would you say, revitalize language and culture and things like that, and have ongoing struggles with regards to access to those cultural resources and sites that are critical in terms of maintaining, your cultural identity. Things like resources that are on private lands that people don't have access to, sacred sites that are about to go underwater with the Centennial River Dam. They're about to dam the Bear River. Things like that. In some sense, we're really talking about an ongoing issue with regards to how it is that what would you say, we haven't reconciled this notion of how to share California in some sense in an equitable way with regards to making room for at home and other people. Anyway, that's just my few words, opening spiel, I guess. I think we're really meant to sort of communicate and dialogue. So, whatever questions or thoughts are on your mind about that, I'd be happy to address that or connect with some of the other topics that we have here. So, do you have any thoughts or any questions or anything on your mind about that? Yeah.
How are they able to keep the land that they do have?
They're federal trust lands. So in some sense, there are agreements with the federal government and the tribes in order to basically the federal government is holding the land in trust for the tribes, and in that way they become tribal lands. Is that an accurate description? Ish.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
So in California during the Mexican-American War, the United States really wanted to keep the California Indians out of the war. So one way they did that was negotiating treaties with the tribes for land bases, but to make sure that they didn't take part in the war. After the war was over, the Senate did not approve any of the 18 treaties. So it wouldn't be until the early 20th century that presidential administrations would, through executive order, establish the lands. So this is still something that, in terms of California Indian history, that they're trying to fight for these 18 treaties, but it was really a way to keep California Indians out of the war, and ultimately, the land you see here at the time they were negotiated was the land that was thought to be the least desirable or have minerals.
When these places were selected for Native Americans to stay there, did they have sufficient resources to keep themselves self-sustainable, like so they don't need the help of any outside?
No, not a chance. I don't know, maybe you could chime in and agree with that, but, you know, if you, in some sense, if you've been to the plots of land in our local area which are ultimately, you know, the rancherias, you would realize that, you know, by barely one family could make a living on that particularly small plot of land. Nevertheless, a whole tribe of people, and particularly when you're considering, you know, the cultural and economic systems of Native California cultural groups really relied on, you know, a wide array of resources, regionally speaking. So in some sense, locating a particular group into like a couple of blocks really ultimately undermines the ability to, in some sense, survive in traditional life ways, and becomes, you might say, an additional strategy for. You might say forcing, in some sense, indigenous people to assimilate or convert, into more Western sorts of modes of living. It's a great question.
I wanted to add something. I read a book a while back, and it's called Killers of the Flower Moon, and I just looked up the author because I forgot the author's name. Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann, Grann, and it was about Osage Indians in Oklahoma that were displaced and put on this reservation. And the reservation that the government inadvertently gave them was sitting on the biggest oil reserves in the United States. And they became immediately extremely wealthy. Well, you'd think that that'd be a great story, except all of a sudden there was murder after murder after murder of the Osage peoples, and the guardians were Americans who were purportedly guarding their estates and so on. It's an excellent book. It's a nonfiction book, and it's by David Grann, Killers of the Flower Moon.
So if y'all, maybe just check in with a minute. Do you all know this already? Is this all old information, that you've heard in your high school or middle school or elementary school history classes? So I see a few nods. Other questions? Go for it.
No, I was just gonna say, no, when I was going to school, we were never taught anything about the American.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, that's just kind of sad, but that's how.
Mm-hmm.
There was just like African American history. I think we covered like maybe a couple days during the month of February.
Mm-hmm. We're gonna add to that too?
I was just going to say, I learned some of it, like, the whole access law, like how you kind of feel those parts in, how they didn't want them to fight for the war, I didn't know that. And I didn't know they kind of like annexed some of the land, but I didn't know that the whole, they basically, was interested in California.
Yeah.
I honestly didn't know any of this, and I'm kind of in awe of the fact that we don't, due to the fact that this is our land and this is our history.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering why we don't know this. Like, why are they not in our school systems more often, and why are we not, like, taught this?
I'm really glad you asked that, and I think it's a really important question. And I guess my answer, which I guess is one answer probably among many, is it's really the ongoing project of erasing indigenous people from California. in the some sense that as once we recognize, this historical injustice, then in some sense we have to acknowledge that, the history of our state, is shrouded in injustice. And it really creates a responsibility to recognize and to try to address and to do something about it. It undermines things like, basic notions of property ownership and those sorts of things. So in some ways, our whole California identity and culture, economy, and et cetera, is based on the really. What we say, lie, I guess you'd say, that's sort of really hidden in plain sight, is really quite interesting. And I think it's interesting that more recently there's been more publications and information that's coming out about it, and it's one of those things that I think it's really important that we do find a way to educate more, especially younger people about it. Dennis, do you have a question back there before we?
I just had a comment. I think it just depends on the area you went to school. I'm originally from the Bay Area, and in my history classes, we learned about African American history, we learned about Native American history, we learned about the Chinese American history. So it just kind of depends on what location you're at.
Important point. Thank you very much.
Can I ask how many Native Americans are here today with some Native American blood? Thank you.
So I have a question about when, if ever, in your education, did you hear about or learn about Native Americans?
I learned a lot in elementary school.
Okay, and for many of us, probably we learned about Native Americans around Thanksgiving time, maybe? Okay, and what's that kind of typical story? Yeah.
Like they basically like portrayed Native Americans like they were the enemy, like how somehow
Okay.
their resistance to being colonized and was wrong. Like it was the right thing to do, or it was just artist's manifest destiny
Uh-huh.
to expand upon like the land and trek to every corner of not California, but America period, and just fulfill this dream.
So as an opposition.
Yeah.
That's how
When I was a kid and learning about Thanksgiving, we were taught that there was like a particularly harsh winter, and that the Indians and pilgrims came together and like shared food and supplies, and then had this big meal to celebrate.
the first Thanksgiving, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to hear the audience comments.
Okay.
Maybe some.
Okay. So she had mentioned the first Thanksgiving.
If I forget, I should have mentioned, we only have one little microphone here, so be as forceful as you can when you speak. Thank you.
I just had a question. So there's kind of that phrase called like, if you don't learn from or like acknowledge history, you're doomed to repeat it. Do you guys think that's true in a sense, or that it's going to happen, or that it's still happening today? To an extent.
I mean, it's certainly that's the first part of the process to not repeat the same mistakes, is to make sure that we understand those mistakes, but it doesn't necessarily ensure they won't happen again. So part of it is learning about it, and part of it is sort of understanding the basis for that. So, and I know I'll let Ralph kind of get going here, but it's, unfortunately, we see the same things happen repeatedly in different ways throughout American history to deprive people of property in their homes and way of life.
And I think part of the question that I was asking is that for many of us, we learn about Native peoples only up until around the 18th or 19th century. And then after that, they disappear. And typically, we might learn about Squanto. We might dress up like Indians if they still do that in elementary schools for Thanksgiving. Hopefully not. But what we don't learn is from that past. All right. In planning for this, we were talking about how other countries that have had horrible, horrible episodes in their history, they introduce those tragic events early on. I travel through Germany a lot, and it's around 4th or 5th grade that German kids in elementary school are taught about the Holocaust. All right? It was something that took a while, I think until the 1960s, to enter into their schools, but it's something they learn their entire lives. Germany's kind of an interesting place because it's still a very Catholic country, and at the same time you have this Holocaust, so there's a lot of guilt there, right? But the thing is, they actually talk about it. All right? They certainly differ in terms of the way they engage it. So I'd moved this slide, which looking at 19th century Native American removal, which we never address. Sometimes you might hear about the Trail of Tears, all right? So maybe that's a term you've heard of before, but we don't ever really learn from it in a way that we try not to commit those types of things again. So I'm not going to go into all of these different removal policies of groups, but what you see here are the trails of tears, not just of the 5 civilized tribes in the southeast, but a process throughout the 19th century, which began during the colonial era, of moving and displacing native peoples from their homes, or something I want to talk about, their homelands. Yeah.
I think another reason why things are like that is also just the way that they're portrayed in media. I mean, look at movies like Pocahontas, or I think there's this one movie, I think it's, I can't remember when it is, but now I think like in the late 80s or 1990s, it's basically about like this South Asian guy, and he joined this group, and he basically helped save them from getting
Dances with Wolves.
Yeah, Dances with Wolves.
Yeah, Dances
And again,
with Wolves,
these
yeah.
are all examples of the way American society and culture engages with native peoples, that they're from the past. We never let them join us in the 21st century. All right? And then sometimes like, well, if you're not like out there on a spirit quest or dressed with medicine pouches, you're not really native, or you don't look the way I think natives should look like from Hollywood movies, right? Yeah. One thing I think I wanted to connect with was something that you might have familiarity with, and that's the Trail of Tears, and that's the removal of native peoples out of the southeastern United States under the Jackson administration. All right. So I want to again engage this idea of home, because I think for native peoples, home is more than real estate. All right. It's not like you've been driven from your profitable real estate investment and you're losing equity now and it's a bad day. All right. For native peoples, they're tied and connected to their ancestral homelands. So we hear homeland a lot in terms of security and terrorism and things like that. But what we're looking at here are people who have a connection to the land, a connection to each other, and you have a different religious explanation for why they're there in that particular land. It's not that they just decided to move there. They have a connection to it. And this is, it's going to look long up here. I'm going to read it out. But it's from a Choctaw man who was about to be forced out of his home and driven to the Oklahoma Territory. So hopefully this gives you an idea in terms of, this is more than they're giving up their nice home, their nice house, a garden, a picket fence, or equity, right? And that is in their real estate. And that is, here is the land of our progenitors, and here are their bones. They left them as a sacred deposit. And we've been compelled to venerate its trust. It is dear to us, yet we cannot stay. My people are dear to me, but with them I must go. Could I stay and forget them, to leave them struggle alone, unaided, unfriended, and forgotten by our father? I should then be unworthy of the name Choctaw, and be a disgrace to my blood. I must go with them. My destiny is cast among the Choctaw people. If they suffer, so will I. If they prosper, then I will rejoice. Let me ask you to regard us with kind feelings. So we already see before he endures the horrible nightmare that a third of the 5 civilized tribes will die in this process of being forced to Oklahoma. His idea of home's changing now, right? Where is home? With his people, right? But he can't resist what is going to happen, and that's a massive military eviction of the people. All right. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
If you look at the statistics of the actual like multiple Trails of Tears,
Yeah.
and you see at the death count of how many people died in each tribe, and you're the one forcing these people out, like how do you deal with that morally, or how do you feel like that, like that's the right thing to do, although, you know, putting them through the same situation, knowing that, you know, sending them away to lands that they've never seen before is like a good thing. How do you keep that, you know?
Well, one, I would say the United States has never reflected upon that, right? Because I think there's a question back here, like some schools mention it, others completely ignore it, or they give nice fantasy Walt Disney tales of Pocahontas and Squanto. Okay, so it hasn't happened, and especially if we look at the Southeast, it's much more complex than people wanting the land. It has to do with the expansion of slavery after the creation of the cotton gin. That land is now profitable for cotton. A gold rush in Georgia. And the term 5 civilized tribes is reference to tribes that have taken up the process of westernizing, because President Thomas Jefferson said, if you westernize, you can live among whites. Well, in the South, slavery is justified economically and also on an idea of white supremacy. So if you have the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek and Seminole, and now they're planting cotton, they own slaves. They're competing economically with whites, and the Cherokee are now outperforming the state of Georgia. That challenges your view of white supremacy. You're like, wait a second, this non-white, non-Christian, and many of them are adopting Christianity, they're outperforming us. That's a threat to our order. What if white Georgians start to move to the Cherokee reservation and work with them? So you gotta get rid of them, right? So there's so many complex things, but we can't even get past Squanto and Pocahontas. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One, so I'm related to Pocahontas, but my idea of my ancestor is Disney. So do you have a recommendation for us to find the most legitimate knowledge and history of Native Americans anywhere we can look for that?
Well, I would say kind of like standard history responses. You want to go back to primary sources, right? You want to go back to reflections of people who from that time, all right? You might want to take my Native American history class.
Don't read John Smith. Don't read John Smith.
Don't read John Smith. That's where Pocahontas comes from.
And then also, why don't we share the land? From the beginning, we've kicked them off. Is it just due to pure selfishness of we want all of the land and all of the resources, and we're not sharing with the original?
Well, you know, I think when we look at this, there's a different reason for each of these nations that's getting uprooted and pushed, right? And certainly we're seeing a desire for that land to make plowed under cotton, or what Joe talked about, get the petroleum, or in the case of the Cherokee in Georgia, is keep whites and native people separate from each other. Okay, so it's various, but it all comes back down to colonization.
Yeah, and to reiterate your point you made a minute ago, the white supremacy is in some sense a common denominator.
Yeah.
I kind of had a question about the map. So are they all going to Oklahoma or are they all leaving Oklahoma?
So Oklahoma at one time was considered Indian territory, so it was essentially one big concentration camp. Then it would get opened up later because resources would be found there, and it would become the state of Oklahoma.
Oh, and I just wanted to comment on what you had said. Basically, they basically made it morally right by dehumanizing these people by saying they're less than human, and that's how people are able to do such cruel things like, you know, the Holocaust, the Indians, African American. They're portrayed as less human, so it makes it easier to just be like, oh, okay, they're not on my level, so it's okay to do this.
Yeah, definitely. That's a part of that makes it easy to then kick somebody out of their home.
Right.
You know, I read this book called The Everyday Life of the American Indian, and I thought, how can you generalize that much? But it's from a Tennessee professor, I forget his name, but anyway, he said, we took away their livelihood. And that stuck with me, like, that's your whole culture and everything else. How you make your living and everything that we took away. By taking away their land, we took away their livelihood. And that just stuck in my head about what we did to them.
Yeah, definitely.
I was just gonna say, like, now, like, in today's era, I kind of, maybe it's just me, but, like, it seems like they can't really push people out of, like, the United States. Like, they can't just come here and be like, well, you guys need to go. But, like, now I see them starting to find people and send them back to their country. They're not a citizen. it's like, and then I see like it's kind of messing up the economy. Like I read something in the news like with this whole ice thing that's going, sending people back like to Mexico and stuff. Like the economy, the farming economy is like getting so bad because they kind of do this type of stuff. And I feel like now it's like they can't just push a big crowd of people out at one time, but they can do it one by one. I feel like they're kind of trying to makes sense. But just with a bunch of different minority groups, like not only Mexican Americans, it could be people that are from the Middle East, right? That want to come back here, like with their passports. And I feel like that's just like another way of trying to push people like back to where they're from or come from, you know? But it's like they can't do that because everybody's so diverse in Mexico. It's like it still seems like it's going on, just in a different way.
Can you repeat back what you said? Because you can't.
Oh, sorry. No, I was pretty much saying that, like, in this era, like how they were pushing everybody out and trying to put everybody where they felt they belonged. It's like they don't do it in that way now, but it's like they still do it. Like you still have people from ICE coming to random cities and taking people back to where they come from. And I was saying how I watched the news and like economically, like farming and stuff is taking a downfall because they're sending all these people back to where they come from, you know? So it's like they're still doing it now, but they're not doing it, I guess, on a level of that magnitude, but it's still happening, like one by one, slowly.
I think again, this kind of speaks to this idea of home, or then when we look for Native peoples, right? And that's the idea of homeland, right?
I mean, some of us
Where,
been here forever, like
yes.
families, and then they strip them away from.
yeah, and that's that connection, right, to homeland. Yeah.
And then they've made a living, they've made a family, they've worked here for 40 plus years, and then one day, you get caught at the traffic light, and it's like.
Yeah, and I think, when we look at something like the Native experience, right, is that you can have, as a result of this never being something explored by American society, that this is forgotten, and then somehow the people who replace them, this is now their home, and they're now the ones to determine who's foreigner.
But then it's
right?
like even today when they're sending all these people back, like, not trying to be funny, but then you have like Trump in office and he's making all these calls, and then everybody looks at it like a white supremacy. Like, he's like just like a racist, whatever you want to call it. And then you have people thinking of it like all these different ways. It's not even as simple as somebody's just getting sent back home. Now it's because of who made the call to do that, and like who's in charge and who does what. And then it just gives everybody like this different way of thinking about just everything. Like the United States, just freedom is whole home, I guess you would say. Like it just all comes into question.
I wanted to ask you what you thought about the 2009 congressional apology that we gave that almost was about news. And have you seen things get better or worse?
So, I mean, I think it was definitely something that was not heard. And we certainly need to look at the things like the Dakota Access Pipeline to see that that was something that was really overlooked, right? Yes, I don't know.
Yeah, and I'd say that in some sense an apology without any sort of meaningful measures taken to address the ongoing impacts of deep and tragic injustices is sort of like a meaningless gesture in a sense.
Yeah,
Not meaningless, but empty. Maybe is another way to say it.
We're really good at apologies, but
Yes.
when it comes to actual sort of measurable reparations, which is what we're talking. Whether it's when we say reparations, I think people think of a financial reference, but any kind of sort of societal, comeuppance, for lack of a better way to put it, to remedy the wrongs that we've done, regardless of which group we're talking about.
I want to go to another slide. This is from not a Native person, but a New Yorker, white New Yorker, who came upon people being forced, Cherokees, to the Oklahoma Territory. Because what we're looking up here is, there's this discussion about apologies, right? You can make a presidential order to say we apologize, but I think since most Americans have very little contact or knowledge of Native history, And if it ends at Squanto, or if it ends at Dances with Wolves, right, we may feel that the past is over. And sometimes you hear people say, well, just get over it. Forget about it. That's in the past. As if Americans would ever forget Pearl Harbor or 9/11. So for these communities, the Trail of Tears, or being removed, or having their families ripped apart through boarding schools, these are events like they happened yesterday, right? I think we can look at, and this is from an outsider, not like the Choctaw man who's about to go, is that what he saw happening on the Trail of Tears, all right? And when this happens to your great-grandparents, they're going to pass on that trauma, and it's going to impact your community in so many ways. Here, on Tuesday evening, we fell into a detachment of the poor Cherokee Indian, about 1,100. We found them in the forest, camped for the night, under a severe fall of rain. Many of the aged Indians were suffering extremely from the fatigue of the journey and ill health. We found the road literally filled with a procession for nearly 3 miles in length. The sick and the feeble were carried in wagons. Multitudes go on foot, even aged females apparently nearly ready to drop in the grave. We were traveling with heavy burdens on the sometimes frozen ground with no covering for feet. They buried 14 or 15 at every stopping place, some carrying a downcast, dejected look, or despair, or other wild, frantic appearances, as if to pounce like a tiger under their enemies. Okay? And this would last from March to November. Right? A third of the Choctaw Chickasaw Creek would die in this process. They're not going to forget that. And then they say, oh, that was the past. Or to make up then a story that, well, it had to happen for progress. That's not getting over. That's justification. All right? And when they would make it to Oklahoma, it wouldn't change because they would open up Oklahoma for homesteading. So once they get there, now they're displacing other native peoples. Now they're fighting with other people. Oklahoma is their home. And they have to rebuild essentially the destruction of their culture. And then once they stabilize to some degree, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, we'll see with the passage of the Dawes Act, that land will be opened up to white homesteading, meaning given away for free. You just have to take it. Right? And whatever wasn't given away gets to be sold off by real estate speculators. This is real. This isn't a satirical, this is a land speculator broadside. And this is something that we just don't talk about, we don't discuss. We expect this community to get over it. It's in the past, it's history. But I think it speaks more to the idea that somehow the United States is exceptional, right? And what that really does, it whitewashes the history of what has happened. Or, well, then you must hate America.
Well, I think you get at something, Rob, by saying that is one of the challenges we face, I think, for a long time, especially at the K-12 level, in the teaching of history, is that somehow that desired need to, instead of giving the complex nuance that is our history, the good, the bad, and the other, it's always had this mixture of nationalism poured in, more or less. It's gotten better, but it's still there to some level. And that this progressive view of history that things are always getting better. When the reality is history's or it goes back, it's not that easy.
No, I was just going to say, you know, if you were to tell the late Romans that pretty soon that their empire was going to go into decay and then Europe was going to go into what we call the Dark Ages and they'd be hit by wars and religious wars and plagues, you'd be like, yeah, you're crazy. We have an amazing civilization, right? And that history is not this, progression or progress.
Sure. Okay, I'll go ahead and,
Sorry.
are you your last
Question
slide?
here.
Oh, go ahead.
It made me think about the narrative of stories of literature, because I thought about Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls, and like them moving, like you can relate to them because they talk about their narratives. But we don't hear stories like Sitting Bull or other Native people about their struggles, and that it gets not popularized because I think it's something that I can like
reach out in my mind and take like, oh, I remember reading that story and I can relate to that a little bit, or I could feel like what the person's going through. You don't hear native voices. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of move us a little bit, but I'm going to ask a question first, because my primary area of focus outside of just sort of the broader narrative of American history is African American history. So I want to ask, when we think of the theme driven out, and we think about African Americans as a population in our society, what specifically comes to mind for you as you want to sort of jump in? Slavery, obviously, right? Anything else?
Black power.
Gentrification. How so?
Oh, what were they called? The Black Panthers.
The Black Panthers, in terms of driven out, how are you sort of connecting it to the theme of being driven from home?
Well, you know, a rental agent could when they interview you, if you're in an apartment or something, they could make some excuse like, we don't have any rooms available.
Yeah.
Or they won't go too right. They won't say the real reason.
Certainly. Yeah, so your involvement in the Black Panthers could lead to you being targeted,
Yeah.
or just being African American in general. And so gentrification, yeah.
I think of Marcus Garvey because one of his primary focuses was trying to connect back to what they believed what the home was out of the home.
Yeah, so again, so Marcus Garvey, Pan-Africanism, that sort of building black nationalism within the United States seen as a threat. The other thing, and I'll throw out a few others, and one that I think a lot of people don't focus on, which is kind of the area that I'm going to talk about as a way to kind of explore this idea further, because it's an aspect of our history we don't really hear much about. One is sort of the post-Civil War period, which for a lot of, at least when I took that period of time in American history in college, and when I'm saying that, it's sort of 1860s to the 1900s. My teachers were so sort of wanting to get to the 20th century, World War I. I don't know if you had the same experience. We didn't spend a lot of time in the late 19th century, which when we talk about especially the lives of African Americans, it's an extremely key point in time, because it's a point in time where you have, and not just Southern blacks, certainly Southern blacks are experiencing freedom that emancipation brings, and for a brief moment in time, in the 1860s through the late 1870s, there are opportunity. There's social mobility that they have never seen in the South before. The first, I think a lot of people don't realize this, the first African American congressmen in this country are not from the North, they're from the South. And that happens during Reconstruction. In the late 19th century, they're gone because of segregation, but it's such a key part of our history. But the period of time I really want to look at, especially as it relates to our theme, is this period from after Reconstruction through the early 20th century. And not just in the South, but from a national perspective. Because I think one of the narratives we get in school is that, especially the sort of pre-Civil War period, going into the Civil War, is that the North is good, right, and the South is bad. So sometimes we equate that with the South is racist and the North is not. And the reality is that's not the case. It's untrue. In many ways, Northerners were just as racist as Southerners. And we're going to see that play out in the late 19th century in an aspect of our history that doesn't often get talked about. And this is a quote from Olivia Hooker. Olivia Hooker was, and Tulsa's not a northern city by any sense of the imagination. It's Oklahoma, so it's considered largely a southern or midwestern city. And this is in the wake of one of the worst race riots in American history. And I know some of my students who are here know about this Tulsa race riot, but just a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the Tulsa race riot of 1921? It's one of the worst race riots in our history. Literally thousands of people were deprived of their homes, hundreds of people killed in the course of a few days. I'm going to get back to this. The other is the subject of migration, is the great migrations that happen of African Americans in American history, whether it's in the early 20th century or the late 20th century, fleeing the segregation of the South, fleeing the conditions of the South, but also being pulled towards northern industrial jobs during the war, World War I and World War II. This is a quote from a wonderful book, by the way, looking at the Great Migration that's come out just recently. And this is one of these people that moved it occurred to me that no matter where I lived, geography could not save me. And it's a great lead-in to really what I want to focus on is that when African Americans in this period of time after Reconstruction, so 1877 to 1930, looked to flee the conditions of the South. And when I say the conditions of the South, no longer having protection of federal troops, which even when they had it was somewhat limited. Having the ability to participate politically, which they had for a period of time, but lose it due to poll taxes and sort of systematic disenfranchisement throughout the South. They look to go elsewhere, not surprisingly. And many of you how many of you have heard of the Exodusters? These were African Americans in the South that starting really in the 1870s and into the 1880s and 90s, flee the South to find opportunities, and this is an advertisement for pushing for the creation of a settlement in Kansas. And we see lots of these in the 1870s and 80s, where groups of African Americans getting together, pooling their money together, trying to find a different way of life outside of the Jim Crow South and what was becoming an extremely violent society in the 1870s and 80s. This is a poster from, anybody want to guess where this is from? What part of the country? Yeah, this is from the north. This is from Detroit. This is from Detroit in 1948. And, I'm sorry, 1942. And it's a historical development in Detroit that leads to one of the worst race riots in our history, which is the Detroit race riot of 1943. Part of it driven by the Great Migration. That is, you have an influx of African Americans into these areas like Detroit, Chicago, and others. This is in the sort of connection with the Second Great Migration. But dealing with that tension and African Americans being targeted and being scapegoated for poor housing conditions and competition for employment. So you can see in this image here, these images, by the way, there's a whole slew of them from Life magazine from 1943, and here's a police officer trying to keep a mob from beating up an African American boy in this image. But literally what whites in Detroit did was cordoned off the black neighborhood in Detroit in 43 and literally pushed further and further in until they just ransacked the entire black portion of Detroit in 1943. This image comes from Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. In Wilmington, North Carolina, you had a couple of things. Those of you who have taken me for African American history, like, oh gosh, I'm probably going to have to know this, aren't I, Jay? Because we talked about this in class, but Wilmington was a thriving black middle-class neighborhood, had a thriving black middle-class neighborhood. And the picture you see here is a picture of a white mob posing for a photo, which tells you something, right? Anytime you pose for a photo, it means what? What? Yeah, that you're proud of it and you fear no what? Repercussions, right? If I rob a bank and I stand in front of the bank with a bag of money going, hey, nobody does that. So the assumption here is there's no repercussion. And so in Wilmington, what happens is the newspaper editor of the newspaper, you see the building behind that's been torched, had written an article. And he had written an article criticizing the practice of lynching because white advocates in the South and nationally had pushed for using lynching as a way to especially discipline what they said were African American men who were raping white women. Reality was that wasn't happening. It was a justification. We talk about this all the time in my classes. You can have a justification, but in most cases the justification is very different from the what? From the reality or the motive, the true motive here. Because Alex Manley suggested in this editorial that no, these white women weren't being raped by black men. They were in consensual relationships with black men, and it was socially disapproved of, and so they screamed rape because they didn't want to be beaten up themselves. And so his paper was burned to the ground in 1898, and for good measure, they torched half of the black community in Wilmington, and thus drove out a good significant portion of the population. So again, I'm largely focusing on the South. This is a picture from Tulsa in the Tulsa race riot. These are a little bit out of order, sorry about that. And that's not, there we go. That's not, I'm missing an image, Joe. Okay, yeah, that's okay. Well, that's okay. One of the other images I had in here was we have a number of race riots that happened in the late 19th, early 20th century in northern towns whose sole purpose is to drive out African American residents. And then once that happens, these towns, and most of them are fairly small, become what are called sundown towns. Has anybody heard that term before? And so sundown towns is a reference to any town where if you're an African American or a person of color, depending on if you're talking about the West Coast, they have them here as well, that if you're caught outside or in these towns after dark, you better hide. And so we saw a number of these sundown towns really as the aftermath. So you have a race riot, you push out the black population in many of these areas, whether it's in states like Illinois or Wisconsin. These aren't southern states. And then in the aftermath, you establish ways to keep them out. And so when I think of driven out, I think of this sort of, for African Americans in our history, the idea of, yeah, slavery is sort of the initial driven out, but it's a consistent driven out, right? Driven from one place to the next. And I think for that community, and it sort of gets to Du Bois, and I'll stop and sort of take questions here. Du Bois always talked about, for African Americans, there's a double consciousness, and some of you here are probably familiar with this concept, that as African Americans, you're both what? You're both American, but you're also black. And those two things aren't the same thing. And that for African Americans, I think we can argue on one level, this sense of America as a, quote, home, as someone else might seem to view it, doesn't really exist. Because home, for a lot of us, is where we feel what? Ultimately, totally safe, right? And so I think that you can make a strong argument that historically speaking, and not even historically, we still see them, and Kai mentioned gentrification, same kind of thing. Gentrification, the process of taking older urban areas, quote unquote, improving them, raising rents, and then pushing out people in those areas which disproportionately are people of color. So go ahead, Bree.
I was thinking, like you were saying, how there's a double consciousness and you feel safest where you're at home, like where you know. And I think it's hard for African Americans to feel home here in America or in Africa, because many Africans that I know, they've criticized African Americans, saying you're so disconnected from your culture. But then you have movements here like Black Lives Matter because black people don't feel safe in America. So it's kind of like, where is it? For a lot of black people, I know this.
Yeah, because you're African American, you're not African, but you're also not included in the American narrative in the same way. So the whole notion of, and that push, that movement, that sort of back to Africa movement, which has a long history in our society, going back to people like James Madison and others who said, well, the only way we're going to deal with this problem is send our slaves back to Africa. To people like Marcus Garvey, this idea of creating but the challenges with that no, I'm not African, I'm African American, I don't want that, right? Other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead, Sonia.
I feel like the term African American, Asian American, all those terms are a way of just keeping people separate. Because if you go to Great Britain, they're not like, oh, you're Great Britain, blah blah blah. There's like, you're whatever. If you go to China, you're Chinese. They're not like, oh, you're Chinese, blah blah blah. I feel like America is the only place that actually categorizes people like that. And I feel like it's just a way of just separate.
Okay, that's a good point.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, isn't race and racial categorization a way of separating people and keeping us separate? Because, like, in sociology, we learn that the concept of race really isn't real. That the only substance there is to it are biological differences. And even in that, people within the same racial category have more biological variation because they're different.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I just feel like it's always been a way of separating.
Well, we always constantly have, and that's the dilemma, right? The dilemma is there's no biological basis for race, that it's entirely a social construct. But we have a society, I'm not saying we in this room, but we as a society both now and historically have given that meaning, right? We've structured our society around it. So how do we uncouple ourselves from looking at people in a racial categorization, but at the same time recognize the issues related to it, you know what I mean, in terms of historically and the stuff we still deal with today. So I don't know who had their hand up first. Go ahead, Demetrius.
So my question is for you.
Yeah.
Why do you think blacks haven't received reparations, or African Americans haven't received reparations?
Why haven't they? Why haven't African Americans received reparations for, are you talking about just in treatment in general, slavery specifically? I mean, there's this wonderful article, and he wants me to promote it probably. If you haven't read it, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a great writer, wrote an article for The Atlantic on this very subject. And it does this it gives you the quickest run through as to justifications for reparations, and then how that might look, right? We're not talking about, a cash payment, but what would be the most meaningful way to provide reparations for African Americans? So to answer your question, first of all, we haven't done that as a country really in many instances, right? The Japanese internment, there was some reparations to the survivors, not significant, but some. There's been some small instances of reparations. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. And I don't know from a Native American perspective if there's ever been reparations paid to any group whatsoever.
Putting pipelines through your home and things like that.
No, one of those things where the federal government says, we screwed up, here's some money. So when I think of reparations, at least as the federal government usually defines it, so that's part of the issue, is we've been very hesitant to do that. The other thing is slavery specifically. I think what a lot of Americans look at, well, it's certainly the federal government was involved, but also private companies were involved, private individuals were involved. So how do you get to that? So that's this sort of, this is too difficult, let's not deal with it, right? So it's, and then we get to the whole message of what's the best way to do it, right? What's going to be the most beneficial way that both empowers African Americans in the sense that they have a role in determining what the nature of those reparations are, but are constructive for them.
Can I add to that too?
Yeah, go ahead.
A lot of it goes back to the other point that you made earlier, in some sense about the to get over it mentality.
Yeah.
And in some sense, the reparation would draw visibility, right? In some sense, to the historical context in which we have inequality, racial inequality in our society, and that in some sense would make white privilege and white supremacy really visible. And in the end, we, as a society and culture, we don't have an interest in doing that. But we should work towards it.
Yeah. So I'm going to go here, and then there.
Well, I read this book by a woman.
I'll get you next.
A woman therapist or something, and she was doing workshops mainly for American men, I think, or something, because she says the dominant culture, the white culture, knows nothing about the Mexicans, the blacks, or Chinese. We only know our own culture because it's the dominant culture. Whereas the Mexican, the blacks, and the Chinese, they know their own culture, plus they know how to work in the dominant culture. So they know both cultures, right? They know how to act in their own culture from their home, and then they know how to exist in the white culture, which is a detriment to the white population because we don't understand them. And that's why we have our kind of thinking where, why are they doing that? And why are they saying that? And because we don't have an understanding of another culture.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very insightful to me, that you don't know it until it's brought to your attention how little you know sometimes other people.
It's a privilege you have when you're part of the dominant culture.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have to. Whereas if you're not, you have to if you want to survive and work in that dominant culture. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, had something to say about what these two said, and also kind of connects what she just said.
Sure.
The part about having like our own names for ourselves, and like being African American, and like the fact that we might be like the only country that does that, or like that feels that way. I think it's mostly because of different value systems. Every culture has its own value system. The Native Americans had their own value system. The way they did things was completely different than the European way of doing things.
Right.
And I think that even when white people were the minority here, when they first got here, their mindset wasn't at a state to where I want to get to know you. It was coming from a place where I want to take what you have, basically. And I think like different people have different value systems, and that Europeans have a completely different like mindset when it comes to doing things. And their mindset is kind of like geared toward like what's gonna benefit the individual instead of what's gonna benefit the community.
Right.
And I think that it's not that people, Caucasian people want to understand other cultures. I think it's because of that their first motivation is that I'm going to take care of myself before I take care of everyone else. And I think it's the different values that come from different cultures. Because we're capitalistic in that each one of our values is, I have to come up before I think about anybody else. So I don't even think that it's, I think it's just different value system, different morality.
Yeah. Okay. Anthony, did you want to say something? I had your hand.
I'm just agreeing with what you're saying. Wait a second.
Okay. Go ahead, Bree. You wanted to? Did you?
Yeah. So I kind of going back to the reparations thing. I've noticed like some people, they'll say, oh, a reparation that the federal government is giving you, or not really federal government, is that like, oh, you're black or you're Native American or you're Hispanic, you can get scholarships easier than I can as a white person, or you think there's the equal opportunity or whatever, saying that like, oh, people have to do this now because of your skin color, but at the same time, you can go in for a job interview and not get the job because of the color of your skin or because of the way your name sounds or something like that. If it's not John Smith or like Claire.
Right.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
That's my sister's name, Bree. You're failing. No, you're right. I mean, you're getting at white privilege, right? There's aspects of white privilege that if we're not careful that we benefit. Those of us who are white, when we come into every situation, we benefit from. And it gets to this idea of the dominant culture. Because that dominant culture is predominantly white, there are those benefits we get from it. Go ahead, Faithful.
Yeah, so new idea, I'm trying to tie everything together, right?
I know, it's
so it's a
lot
lot
to
of
take in.
information. So the idea of the race, it's going to be ongoing forever. It's not going to change. For those of you that think that, oh, it's going to get better. No, it's not going to get better. I know of hope. I know about hope. Hope is understanding who you are. It's an individual thing. It has nothing to do with a people. It has a lot to do with individual.
Yeah.
I'm from Nigeria, and we have 250 dialects in Nigeria. So I know what it means when it comes to tribalism.
Yeah.
You can walk into an office for a job interview, and when you talk, they ask you, where are you from? I'm from so group of people. You'll be like, all right. We won't call you back. So it's not like this is, we're talking about, it's not like I'm white, I'm black. But they're not going to call me back because I belong to a different tribe.
Yeah.
So the idea of race is how I see a beauty in it, because the beauty I see in it is that it makes us want to learn about people. It makes us want to really get interested in people. When I say my name Faithful, or I say my native name Orozo, it's like, what's that? What's the story behind that? So there is beauty in that. We have to embrace it. We should not try to make everybody one. There is beauty in diversity. So that's what I'm trying to generalize here. So what Brie was saying about some Africans coming from Africa and say African American, and they act that you're separated from where do you belong to? It happens. It happens. I've even fallen into a trap like that where I'd be like, I don't understand this guy, because I don't know how to relate with them because they don't belong here, they don't belong there. So it happens, but the reason why I'm taking African American class, history class, is because I'm from Nigeria. I will care less and say I don't care. But I decided to take the class because I really want to know what happened in the past. Because the only way to move forward is to reconcile the past with the present, then you move forward. So that's what I'm getting from all this, is that the race issue is going to be there, and the diversity is going to be there, but understanding who you are is very important in all this.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
So, just about that, I totally agree with a lot of what you're saying there, especially about the importance of diversity and identity, right, and developing identity, and then from, in some sense, a strong base of identity, interconnecting and learning and relating about other people. But I actually don't agree that racism will always exist. I think in some sense racism should be seen as a specific mode of thinking that has really a historical context and in a particular way, of sort of thinking about folks.
No,
And I would actually say
he didn't say racist.
Race.
Well, I mean, say race, which leads to racism. And I would say too that maybe even in the history of Nigeria, for example, that in the past, the pre-colonial past, there were more, what would you say, positive and fruitful interactions between a variety of tribal groups. And in some senses, in the context of ultimately a racial and racist colonial regime, that different tribal entities are pitted against each other for the power of the colonial empire, and specifically for the extraction of resources, and then send, in some sense, different groups fighting over, resources and et cetera. So I do think that there is the possibility of having difference and a positive, fruitful interaction between people that isn't based in some sort of racial logic or racist thinking. I'm a hoper.
Go ahead, Sonny.
Okay, so this is kind of like a question in the comments. So I'm Haitian. I came out here when I was 6. My family's Haitian, and I feel like in all culture you kind of have this some sense of like racism. It's like this: lighter skinned people, say like in Haiti or whatnot. Like my great grandma was white, and like so some of my uncles and stuff were like lighter skinned. Lighter skinned people, even in Haiti, they're not out here. They tend to be more favored. You know what I'm saying? Like, so, and even in America, it's the same thing. So I feel like, I know there's a thing where it's like, oh, in like 20, 30 or whatever, we're all going to be mixed, so it's not going to matter. Even when that does happen, even if that does happen, we're still going to be able to categorize people like, oh, your eye color, oh, your hair color, and stuff like that. So I kind of what people saying, it's like there's always going to be some type of diversity, and there's always going to be some type of difference that people can point out and be discriminated for.
So I get what you're saying, and there is. I mean,
I think that's more color.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's color, but then again, it's kind of like color and race kind of like, get put into one category.
Well, and for me, my definition of racism I work off of is probably different than the one you see in the dictionary. Is just sort of making assumptions about individual people based off their race or groups of people. Where for me is racism is different from prejudice. Like we can all have prejudice, right? I'm a Cubs fan. I don't like Cardinals fans. They're horrible. It's your call. Don't take it personally. But racism to me it involves not only that prejudice, but you have the societal power on top of it to inflict that racism.
So like white supremacy?
Yeah, exactly. So can an African American be racist toward a white person? And I would say no, because they don't have the societal power to really sort of put that into action. You get what I'm saying? Right? I don't have, as an African American, I don't have the dominant control over the political structure, the economic structure, to enact that form of prejudice in a way that somebody else might who's white. So for me, I'm always very careful when we talk about sort of prejudice within or colorism, as Bree referenced it to. To me, that's a very different thing than what we talk about racism, especially historically in this country. Does that make sense to folks?
Can I say one?
Yeah.
So just one comment. So I just wanted to say I apologize if I have to leave a little bit early. I have to get my son from school. So I just going to leave, but I didn't want to seem rude as I'm exiting from the conversation. So just want to say thank you very much. I really enjoyed being here and talking with you. So
Any specific questions of Matt before he takes off?
Oh, no.
Takes care of him.
Not like that.
I need to say that we have 5 minutes left and other, you've got a 2 o'clock too, do you guys have 2 o'clock?
I'm
But these
okay.
professors have other classes and so on, so we need to wrap this up. Any questions specifically to Ralph or Jay? They're hitting you hard.
I don't know.
Jay.
A lot of them are my students, so I'll start over here. We'll start with you, Sonny. Go ahead.
So, for me, I know you said racism is being able to able to class, but I mean, if you look at the general definition of racism, like you said, the dictionary is just, basically like favoring or being group. But I feel like, I mean, I don't get when people say African American people can't be racist. I don't entirely agree with that.
Okay.
And I know like where you're coming from, but it's just like I feel like we all
definitely. Yeah, okay. Go here.
I was gonna say kind of the same thing as her. I kind of agree with that. But when you said that, the way I think that prejudice is a way of thinking, and then discriminating is putting it into action. So you kind of described it as racism being a mix of the two,
Yeah.
like having that thinking and then being able to act on that.
Right.
So that kind of shifts the way that you think of how if white people can be racist or if black people can be racist. But when you say it like that, it kind of makes it look like black people can't be racist. When I thought. So I don't know. I guess it's just a way that you define racism.
Yeah, well, and for me, it's just we have so much loaded in the term racism, right? It's such a loaded term. When you say you either can be or can't, that's saying a lot to a lot of us. So when I say a statement like that, I'm not saying you can't be racist or you can't be prejudiced. What I'm saying is to be, at least for my definition, to be racist, you have to have that societal power in conjunction with putting that prejudice to work for you.
And I think the other thing with the term racism is that it's a powerful word, right? And it's a powerful word, and it's also a political word that those who benefit from racism and actively seek to continue its use in society and culture and economics and so forth, they have attacked the word to mean something else, where most people see it as being confusing it with the term prejudice and making it out to be a psychological disorder. Right? So that, well, I don't have anything wrong with me, so I'm not racist, although they might be. And in addition to that, you've had an attempt to get rid of race in society, and that's very, very political project, so that you don't have to deal with this history. To the point now where you can call a neo-Nazi skinhead a racist, and they'll say, no, I'm not, because that means I'm a bad person. Right? And so it's very important to understand that the word itself has been attacked to move it to mean something more like, it just means I'm a bad person. It means anything but that.
Is racism based in capitalism? Because I keep thinking about racism as an association with home, but then capitalism is about having property. So if you take away the race component, then it becomes an issue of who has and who doesn't have. And then that creates a kind of hierarchy. And so I'm just wondering if you can get rid of the racist component. Is it the capitalistic thinking that is ultimately driving these wedges and driving, people from home and thinking about the mention of gentrification as well? Then it becomes an issue of capitalism more so than race, or are they just so intertwined that you can't separate them?
Well, yes and no, but I don't think that in terms of other economic systems, whether it's been socialism, communism, or mercantilism, it still exists.
Yeah, I think it's more fundamental to the concept of
You've
power.
got 2 minutes and 2 questions.
Go
This
ahead,
gentleman
Anthony.
and that gentleman.
I know, Anthony, you've had your hand up for a while.
I totally agree with what you guys were saying as far as the clear difference between racism. I think one of the things people don't understand, I agree that racism is systematic. You have to, one race has to be empowered to literally enforce it, even if it is in a certain way. Prejudice is more like the thoughts and what you think, when it comes down to like the mentality and mindset about a specific people. You can't be like, I'm black. I can't be racist. I'm not empowered. Yeah, like I can only be prejudiced. I can only think and say this stuff about people. But at the end of the day, I can't be like, you know what? I'm going to round up a group of people and try to persecute this person. I don't have that ability, nor the power, nor the funds, nor the, just the will with other people.
Yeah, the term reverse racism I find really challenging.
But I will say,
Typically, that those who say it don't recognize that there's a forward racism.
To me, it's impossible.
You're saying that doesn't exist, but reverse racism exists.
Racism, being racist or racism has become like an easier word for people to use. It's just, you see it more. You see that word more, so it's easy to pull it like, oh, he's racist, she's racist. You're not going to hear many people saying this person.
I'm going to have to wrap this up, and I thank you all very much for coming. Let's thank the presenters as well. In 1 month, come and learn a little bit more about some of the other things that have homes, too.
Have a good weekend, my folks. I'll see you next